Chapter 3, The Bicycle Skill Set of Public Relations. I learned to ride a bike at the bottom of a hill on a gravel driveway which turned into a gradient of bricks. I learned this in 1974 at the age of 6 when we lived in Hammondsville, Ohio, not far from where my dad worked at an electrical plant. We moved from our rented house in Hammondsville sometime in '75. My parents bought a home in East Liverpool, and on my birthday during the bicentennial year, 1976, they bought me and my brother Mike new bikes, red, white, and blue 26-inch bikes with banana seats. East Liverpool was like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, extremely hilly and has a river, although Pittsburgh has 3. I hated the hills growing up. I preferred the flatness of a place like Galesburg because I didn't know any better. Our place was the third house on the left after leaving Lisbon Street onto Westfield Road. Westfield went up, flat, up, down, curves, down, and ended at Dresden Avenue under a bridge. Our house was on a terraced hill. It was hilly, and Lake Croft was hilly. Back then you explored your neighborhood and then snuck off into the next one against your parents' orders. The speed and stealth help you accomplish this. Performance on a bicycle was secondary. Its primary mode is transportation. It never occurred to me that the bicycle thing could go on past the teenager years. The fact is that for most, it would end at 16 when they got their driver's license. I did press on, however, through necessity. The cheap road bike I bought at the Four Seasons on Keesler Air Force Base, my permanent duty assignment in Biloxi, Mississippi. Upon leaving the service, I spent a short stint living in Charleston, South Carolina as a contractor. This is where I bought a bicycle number 2 off a contractor that I was sharing rent with. I wouldn't buy a decent bike until 11 years later. When I arrived at Fort Meade, Maryland in the fall of 2003, I had been running 5Ks for 3 years. 2 years prior to my photography school at Defense Information School, I purchased a pair of base model Gary Fisher mountain bikes at the local shop in Beaver, Pennsylvania, a 20-minute drive from East Liverpool. My favorite rides were at night. I had put high-pressure street tires on my bike so that it would go fast on pavement. I wore a belly bag reversed with a CD player in it and would grind up St. Clair Avenue that started in downtown East Liverpool and ended in the suburb of Calcutta. That fall in Washington, D.C., I would encounter another person obsessed with cycling. It would take me by surprise how quickly I got the bug after this chance happening. Fort Meade was a 20-minute drive from Washington, D.C., and 20 minutes west of Baltimore, with Annapolis 15 minutes to the south. Typical autumn with some nice Indian summer weekends. One particular weekend, after an arduous week in class, I went down to D.C. for some sightseeing. The bicycles were everywhere, mostly road bikes, the kind of machines you see in the Tour de France. As I got closer to the White House, the hive of bikes and pedestrians peaked at a large lawn area south of the White House called the Ellipse. Large plexiglass stands were stationed all over the lawn with personal notes in marker written all over them. At the top of each was a marquee that read, Tour of Hope. "What is this about?" I asked a spandex-clad gentleman standing next to his race machine. "Lance Armstrong is giving a benefit for cancer research," he said, and he just rode all the way across the country with a group of riders for the event. It was very important that I noticed the timing of this, as we had just lost Genji's mother to cancer in the spring of 2000, and the fact that I had just added cycling to my running regimen. The stage at the center of the grounds was surrounded by TV cameras and media personalities. A few riders gave speeches at first, some who took the journey with Lance at different stages on the way from California. There were oncologists, researchers, and former racers on the team. Then Armstrong took the stage. It would be the first time I had really experienced being starstruck. I shot video and took photos while this person that I had only seen on TV inspired me. The man's story about not only overcoming cancer, but returning to crush the most difficult sporting event in the world was more than enough to sell me. This would definitely put me on a road bike permanently. After the event, I returned to the base and bought a copy of It's Not About the Bike by Sally Jenkins. I read it, and I was solidly a fan of bike racing and this amazing dude. After I finished photography school, I learned that my unit would be going to Britain during the Tour de France. This was an unforeseen opportunity and would become a new adventure. My unit traveled to Mildenhall Royal Air Force Base in the UK for 2 weeks of summer camp. I convinced my commander, who was also a Lance fan, to let me go down to Paris to see the finish. This would be a record-breaking number 6 tour wins for Lance. The boss agreed to let me go, though giving strict warning to be back on Monday. I made arrangements with the travel agency on base and called my wife back in the States to make sure we had the funds and everything was a go. My trip would be on a standard European-style tour bus traveling a couple hours to the port city of Dover and then across the English Channel. The ferry was a ship with several decks, restaurants, and well, it was a ship. The excitement was so real about this trip as I watched the white cliffs of Britain fade behind us heading for Calais, France. The trip is 90 minutes and I spent it exploring the ship as much as I could. We arrived in Calais early enough to make it to Paris by mid-afternoon, just enough time to tour the crowded Eiffel Tower before sundown. I remember sitting on the bus after visiting the world-famous tower and watching the diamond-shaped strobes light up the 1,063-foot steel monolith. On the days ahead, I would see why they called it the City of Lights. The next 2 days were spent exploring the central sites downtown with our Scottish guide explaining the history of the city. Then we were given the chance of staying at the Louvre or to go to Versailles. I chose the Louvre so I could be on the race course. This is where the final stage of the tour takes place every year. "You show me a hero and I'll show you a bum," said Greg Pappy Boeington. Boeington was a Marine Corps fighter ace in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Pappy was a hero but had enough sense to not put too much stock in that title. This would be a difficult lesson from God, but it would be completely necessary to build me into the man I needed to be in the future. It's very easy to turn our fellow human beings into idols. We read too much into their successes, whether true or not. This would be true of Lance Armstrong, who once said that people who race were running from something. There was a lot of truth in this, not only for him, but for me. My father also, like Armstrong, had a poor childhood. His father skipped out when he was 3, and his mother had married 4 different times. Him and his siblings would suffer for this. This coldness that seeped its way into my father's life would affect me and my brother and sister. Although he loved us, he put too much time into his work and was too distant. For Armstrong, it would be to win at all costs. It was the only thing that mattered. God has always done things in my life to make his points, and this trip was one of those things. Not just about hero worship, but about what he does in spite of our misguided faith in men. I spent 3 days in Paris, and we had to leave the morning of the finish of the race. I didn't get to see Armstrong, but I would in the future. In the meantime, I visited the most beautiful city on earth and listened to our Scottish bus driver tell story after story. It was a good time.